This was the first box of Warhammer that I ever bought, and in it I got introduced to the Death Guard. And as the Warp as well as the Destroyer Plague have essentially morphed their armor into something else, I always thought it'd be kinda cool to create the missing link. The point where he's no longer the Angel of Death, but at the same time he's not exactly a Plague Marine, sort of the in-between point. It was time to do some serious damage. Much like Swiss cheese, a Plague Marine has a lot of holes on him. With some of these more massive holes will be representing the damage that otherwise would have taken out a normal Space Marine, but as a Death Guard, all it did was just release the horrible mutations underneath that. Creating all of this damage did leave the surface incredibly rough, so I glazed a bit of Tamiya thin cement over those areas and smoothed them out. One of the most distinct mutations for a Death Guard is their absolutely horrifying looking stomachs, so I made sure to prep the area and drill out a nice hole so that I'll have a lot of options. Then after cleaning up the area, it was time to do a little bit of sculpting. And as Death Guard like big and slow weapons, I went with the Assault Cannon. I started by grabbing a little bit of putty and putting it in between the arm and the torso. Initially, my idea was to simply reposition the arm, but as I'm making a Death Guard, I had a much better idea. Part of the Death Guard transformation is that they're beginning to bloat up and expand past their armor. So I added some additional putty and squeezed the arm together to create a very distinct visual that the flesh has nowhere else to go and is now beginning to seep out between the armor joints. Then using the sculpting tool, I also added some additional grooves onto the flesh to make it feel a bit more organic. To give myself a lot of different options as to which head I could use, I ended up rolling a bit of putty to create this absolutely enormous neck that is now sticking out of the armor. I think I used just a little bit too much, and early on he did look a little bit like a turtle, but it's something that's going to be easily fixable. Then I sculpted out some of these grooves to make the neck more interesting. As I'm from the Great White North, I had to go with a moose helmet, which should complement his enormous knuckles. Now to create the natural feeling of this flesh simply seeping out of every single corner, I essentially pushed it into the putty itself, which was incredibly satisfying. It also gave an additional explanation as to why he's wearing a cowl instead of a helmet. It's quite common in Death Guard miniatures and artwork to have the stomach display some sort of a mouth or some sort of a horrible mutation, so I wanted to do something similar. And as I wanted to create a very smooth surface, I ended up smoothing out the area for quite some time to ensure that none of my fingerprints were left on it. And while I managed to do the thing I was aiming for, I thought I'd aim a little bit higher and try to create the idea of these absolutely horrifying tentacles that are now spewing out of the stomach area. So if you ever have a bit of indigestion, it could be worse. What I found surprising is that even though it was my second time using this putty, I was actually able to achieve this result with relative ease, especially compared to my previous attempts of trying something similar with green stuff. Before placing them onto the stomach area, this time I tried curling it in my fingers, trying to create a much more natural shape of this tentacle wriggling about. As I've never attempted to make something this thin out of putty, I did try to connect it to several other pieces just to ensure a little bit more security. And as the chosen number of Nurgle is 3, I made sure to include specifically 3 tentacles. Numerology is an enormous part of Death Guard mentality, and I simply had to ensure things were in a specific number. And as I was having quite a bit of fun with these different tentacles, I also made sure to create an additional one at the back that is now pumping an additional poison into the gun. Then I finally used a bit of putty to start filling in those enormous holes with a lot of flesh, trying to create the visual that underneath that armor, even after a very small layer, you already have flesh. The Death Guard and their armor are one. Now, Death Guard shoulders usually have this very distinct feature where one of them looks a lot like a Leviathan pattern and the other one looks like a Cataphractii. So I wanted to do the exact same thing and make it out of 2 separate layers. I hollowed out most of the shoulder, making it very thin and flimsy, but it was now going to be perfect to go on the Terminator. Perhaps early on this Death Guard was not allowing the mutations to fully spill out and was trying his best to contain them inside of the armor. Now I did have one additional hole at the back and I wanted to use something specific. One of my favorite themes behind the Death Guard is that when they're attacking, they work in silence. They do not scream or yell, they simply walk forward quietly, and all you can hear is the tiny ringing of the bells. And of course, the Death Guard are never alone. They're always accompanied by these tiny little creatures they call Little Lords or Nurglings. With this piece essentially being 2 in 1. It's a really cool banner, but additionally, it has the Nurgling swinging about. My initial thought was to attach it at the belt area, but I really couldn't get the angle of the armor correct, so instead I ended up removing a certain portion of it and essentially allowing it to smudge into the armor itself, using a very generous amount of both Tamiya thin cement and sprue glue combined. Last video was brought to my attention that my bases are looking a little bit dull, and that's something I could easily agree on, so for this one I decided to do something a little bit more interesting and thematic. Now the reason for me wearing gloves is because originally I thought I'd make it out of milliput, but I really didn't want to wait an entire day just to have a base ready, so I opted in to go for some cork instead. And after attaching several different rocks, I was gonna go for this large robotic leg, but it didn't really fit the Nurgle theme, and I had something else in mind. I had quite a few of these flamer packs left over, and I thought it'd be a perfect match for this base. As it's essentially just an empty container, I'll pretend like it's full of toxins rather than promethium, and it's now spilling onto the base, releasing the vile stuff. And to make it feel a little bit more natural in this scene, I added several additional rocks so that it appears as if it's leaning against them. Because cork is a very soft type of bark, I did glaze the entire thing with some super glue so that when I'm painting it, I get those nice and crispy edges. Then to provide an additional feeling of a battlefield, I took the shoulder pad and split it in half. Because in this battle, the Ultramarines did not win and the Death Guard reigned victorious. For the armor itself, I wanted to start with a very nice deep brown color. This way, any unpainted areas will just look like a little bit of rust. And instead of working with 30 different shades of green, I decided to work with a singular one, mixing it with the brown and the yellows to create all the shades I'll need. To try and make all of this damage really stand out, I opted in to edge highlight all of the different little areas, which proved to be a little bit difficult as I had to do just an insane amount of edge highlighting. Now for the purple of his hood, I wanted to try something that I haven't done in a long time, and essentially do a little bit of wet blending. It's a very cool technique that allows you to have very smooth transitions that are also really fast and easy to paint. Then for all of the fleshy areas, like always, I did try to mix my own color, but I just really couldn't get something I wanted, so I had to pull out the Bugman glow. But as I wanted these tentacles to look a little bit more interesting, I did mix it in with a little bit of ice yellow and provided these additional textures. Then using Flesh Tear's red, I want to create the visual that these tentacles have just recently bursted out. The contrast paints do have a very strong staining effect, so I made sure to use a lot of water and really go slow with this one. Now at this point, I did have to make a very big decision because I wasn't really satisfied with the armor. Something about it just didn't look right to me, so I had an option. Either suck it up and pretend I like it and, hold my peace forevermore, or I had to repaint the entire thing. The main issue I kept thinking about is that it just really did not match the color. It was a little bit too dark and it just didn't feel smooth enough. I just kept thinking to myself I was trying to match someone else's style and not painting in the way I thought would be perfect for this miniature. Fortunately, glazing this paint over the panels was surprisingly easy and it created a pretty smooth transition that I really enjoyed. By the end of it, I essentially painted the miniature twice, but I think it was well worth it. I'm not sure if you like the new version, but I think it's much better. Then I took the brown color I mixed up earlier and essentially added just a little bit more of that pure saturated brown and created this effect of dirt collecting in the holes. Earlier in the morning, I noticed my bread went moldy, and as I threw it out, I thought it'd be a pretty cool idea to try on the miniature. Now usually this paint is reserved for bronze to create the idea of verdigris, but as it's the same color as the mold, I felt pretty confident that I could get a really good effect out of it. Now for a while, I wanted to try this Uhu glue. It's been sitting on my shelf for over a year now, and I think this is finally the project for it. I mixed in just a little bit of Plague Bear Flesh contrast paint and started by applying it all over the miniature. My initial idea was that it'll be this sort of like bile-like stuff, but it just really wasn't applying that well. So I decided to instead transition onto the Nurgle and to create the idea that it's just a little snot that is coming out of his mouth. Which after a bit of practice turned out pretty good, so I felt confident enough to try it on his stomach and create this very interesting looking saliva. Unfortunately, the initial stuff I put on his arm did peel off and took most of the paint with it. So unfortunately, I am gonna have to repaint that. When the stuff was finally dry, it felt solid enough, so I wanted to try and paint it. However, I also realized that I entirely forgot that I never varnished the miniature, so I had to go old school and do it by hand. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, make sure to like the video if you did, and let's see the final result.